all people at all times and to live by the Girl Scout law.
This year, over 2 million American Girl Scouts are meeting, as we are, because of one woman, Juliette Gordon Low, who started Girl Scouting a long time ago. And she had the vision and the courage to think of this new idea in 1912. When Juliette Low returned from England to Savannah, Georgia in the winter of 1912, she called her friend Nina Pate to
come right over. I've got something for the girls of Savannah and girls in all America, and we're going to start it tonight.
How did you know about that?
Well, I've read some books and seen some pictures, but I wanted to do more than just read and see. I wanted to be part of history, and I knew I had to hurry.
But it happened more than 70 years ago. How could you know it firsthand?
First, my leader and I went to the council office in Washington, D.C. We went through the file cabinet looking at old books and pictures. We saw pictures of Juliette Low as a little girl, her house where she grew up, and a photograph of her in 1912.
She was called Daisy, wasn't she?
That's right. Then she told me a few of the original members of Juliette Low's first troop are still living, including a woman who lives right near here. Do you know she's been a Girl Scout for 72 years?
Wow!
Her name is Marian Cormanax Laxon. Here's a picture of her. I decided to visit her and ask her what it was like back then, whether she remembers Juliette Low, what they did at their meetings, if they earned badges, whether they went camping, who their leaders were. Mrs. S. Laxon, do you remember the first days of Girl Scouting?
Very definitely, very vividly.
What were they like?
Well, it was, we started very simply by having a meeting in the old ladies' home across the street, where they had a large meeting place on the front, on the ground floor. And Juliette Low came and taught us the promise and the laws, and then to tie knots and ropes. She taught us about 12 different knots. The most valuable one was the square knot, and I find that I use that every day. And then she finished us a feast of crackers and milk.
Why do you celebrate March 12th as the founding of Girl Scouts?
Well, I didn't know until Florence Crane, Miss Nina Pape's niece, told me the last time I saw that her aunt wanted her to be in the first troop, and she wouldn't be 10 until the 12th of March. And so that's why we organized on the 12th of March.
What was Savannah like in 1912?
It was a very sleepy little southern city where you knew your own circle of friends. You didn't have a large circle of acquaintances. And really and truly, Girl Scouting changed the city because it opened it up. We really started Women's Lib.
How can I find out more about what Savannah was like in 1912?
Go to Savannah and see for yourself, because you'll still find a lot of people who know all about the old Savannah, and they would love to show you the old places.
Will you show me all the places?
Oh, I would love to. It would give me all the pleasure in the world to share Savannah with you.
Savannah, here I come.
Your hand and I'll take you with me, traveling far and near, seeking a land that needs to be free, where friendship's meaning is clear.
Playing the role of Juliette Low and dressed in one of the early uniforms, the director of the National Center, Fran Powell, welcomes our junior Girl Scout.
Hello, Lisa. Welcome to the Juliette Low birthplace.
I'm glad to be here.
Come on in. Lisa, this is my mama and papa's house. This is where I was born and where I lived when I was a little girl your age. It's also where I grew up and where I lived until I got married. When I married Willie Lowe, his family gave us another house not far from here, and that's where I lived. Inside, we have lots of paintings and sculpture and other things that I did, pictures of my family and old photographs, and even an early Girl Scout uniform that you can look at. And when you see all of that, then maybe we can talk about the early days of Girl Scouting. Would you like to come inside?
Juliet McGill Kinsey Gordon was born in this house on October 31st, 1860, just 2 weeks before the Civil War began. Both sides of her family had been in America since before the Revolution. The Kinsey family played a major role in the founding of Chicago. Her father's family was from the South. They had been the builders of the Central of Georgia Railroad and founders of the Savannah Cotton Exchange.
Pictures from Juliet Gordon's childhood provide some clues to her dynamic personality. 1864, at age 4. The Gordon Children. 1870, age 10. A couple of years later. 1876, at age 16. With her classmates at Stewart Hall, Staunton, Virginia. 1881. 1882, her first trip to Europe. And 1887, in one of her many costumes. Juliet Lowe was a very artistic woman who both painted and did a great deal of sculpturing. Her tools can be seen here along with some of her works. In addition, she learned a skill unusual for women in the 1900s, iron forging.
Wow, initialed gates. These must be her father's initials. And these are Mother's. I knew she took a forging class, but I didn't know she could make anything so beautiful.
In December of 1886, when she was 26 years old, Juliet Gordon married an Englishman, William McKay Lowe, whose family had a home and business interest in Savannah. Juliet and Willie, as her husband was called, moved to England. They also spent time in Scotland and Wales, but usually returned to Savannah in the winter.
Pictures tell only a part of Juliet Lowe's story, so Lisa visits Mary Stewart Gordon Platt, her niece, at her home in Savannah.
Mrs. Platt, do you remember your Aunt Juliet Lowe?
I certainly do. I remember so many wonderful things about my aunt, because whenever she came to town, things started happening.
Is this how you remember Juliet Lowe?
No, it isn't. Juliet Lowe's face was much more animated. She was always smiling or laughing, or her face was very expressive, and I don't think that...
Mrs. Platt tells Lisa about the ghost stories her aunt used to tell at the supper table, and describes her family's concern over Juliet Lowe insisting on driving her own car at a time when there were few cars, and even fewer women drivers. Juliet Lowe's love of animals is legendary, but Mrs. Platt had a personal view.
She usually had several animals with her that she was devoted to. A parrot. I guess you've heard about Polly Poons, haven't you? Her parrot. The parrot, I used to be a little afraid of the parrot that would wander around the house. And one day I almost sat on the parrot by mistake. And what a squawk went up as I tried to sit on Polly Poons.
Gee, I wonder how she became interested in Girl Scouting.
Juliet Lowe became a widow when she was 45, and during the next few years, she experienced impaired health and increasing deafness. She wrote about feeling her life had little direction. However, in the summer of 1911, she met Robert Baden-Powell, who 3 years earlier had begun the Boy Scout movement. During a visit in Scotland, she became so inspired by his ideas that she started a small company or troop in the nearby valley of Glen Lyon. She taught these girls greatly needed vocational skills, as well as the principles of Girl Scouting. Her goal was to help the girls earn enough money to become independent. She taught them to raise chickens and spin wool.
So this is Juliet Lowe's spinning wheel.
When Juliet Lowe returned to London in the fall, she began another troop on Charlotte Street. She continued to support and nurture this troop for many years. Soon she began a second one in a very poor section of London, Lambeth. As in Scotland, she enlisted friends to sponsor the troops and keep them running after she left. It was natural then that when she returned for the winter to Savannah, she would bring over the idea of Girl Guides to America.
That must have been the library where Juliet Lowe planned the first Girl Scout meeting. The girls probably came here too. I bet she served them tea. I've read that afternoon tea, usually with small cakes, cookies, and tiny sandwiches, was always a very special part of Juliet Lowe's Girl Scouting. I wonder if the girls live close by. Did they go to the same school? How did Mrs. Lowe get them together? I'll ask Mrs. Aslaxon. She'll remember.
But Juliet Lowe's very dear friend, who happened to be a very dear friend of my mother's, was named Nina Pape, and she was principal of a school. And when Juliet Lowe came with the idea of Girl Guides, the first thing she did was get in touch with Nina Pape. Said, "Oh, Nina, I have the most wonderful idea for the girls of Savannah, and I want a group of girls who are accustomed to working together." So Miss Nina said, "Well, come out to the school, and we have girls accustomed to working together," and that's how it happened. I was attending that school, and I was among the group chosen.
Another girl chosen from Miss Pape's school was Walton Brewer, now Mrs. Ralph Nance, from Augusta, Georgia. When asked how she remembered Juliet Lowe, Mrs. Nance replied,
"Oh my, yes indeed. She was a charming person and just loved all of the scouts. And when she first came to Pape School, that was her one idea, to organize the scouts. And it was her niece, Paige Anderson, you see, was in Pape School at that time. And so that's where it all got started. She came to the school.
Yes, we were all great friends, and we often did many things together. Many of us even went to the same church.
Wasn't it here that Mrs. Lowe asked Mrs. Anderson to be the first captain? Her daughter must remember. Mrs. Paige Anderson Platt, I'm so glad to meet you. I saw your name on the roster in Savannah while I was there, and your mother's too, because she was the leader of the first troop. You were there when Juliet Lowe came back to organize the Girl Scouts. Do you remember it?
Oh yes, I remember it. She came to lunch and we gave her a good lunch, and then she introduced us to another.
In 1937, at the 25th anniversary of the first troop, Paige Anderson Platt and her mother, the first captain, wrote what they remembered about this historical event.
Mrs. Juliet Lowe, my cousin Daisy, who had just returned from England, came to lunch with my mother, Mrs. J.R. Anderson. Our house faced Lafayette Square, as did Mrs. Lowe's. There were present at lunch my grandmother, Mrs. J.J. Wilder, my mother, and myself, home from school. I was 12 years old at that time, with a large pompadour and a larger hair ribbon bow. Mrs. Lowe was the only guest, and came in late with a strip of leather in her hand, in which, as we talked, she was feverishly trying to tie knots. We asked her what she was doing, and she explained that the girl guides in England, under Lady Baden-Powell, were learning what their brothers, the guides, had been taught by Sir Robert. We all listened with interest, for Mrs. Lowe had the unique gift of immediately interesting others in whatever subject she herself was vitally concerned. The next day was Sunday, and after service on the steps of Christ Church, Cousin Daisy buttonholed my mother. "Now look here," she said in her impetuous way, "I've been thinking all night. I intend to start the Girl Guides in this country, and I want you to be the first captain and get Paige and her friends to make up your troop." Mrs. Anderson agreed, and thus the seed which was to bear such fine fruit was planted.
What was it like having your mother as the scout leader?
Well, she was a lovely person. Everybody was fond of her, and she took care of all of us. She's sitting in the chair that belonged to Thomas Jefferson.
What do you remember about Juliet Lowe?
Well, she was a very busy lady, and she went from Washington to New York, and then New York to London. Well, she used to come over for meals. We used to go over there for meals.
Where did you have your meetings?
Well, different places, and sometimes in my home, sometimes in Mrs. Lowe's home, once in a while in other houses that belong to different scout numbers.
Did you ever use the carriage house?
Once in a while, yes.
This is the building all the early Girl Scouts talk about, the carriage house. It has been used ever since by the Savannah Girl Scout Council. The paint is the same color as it was in 1912. There's a small doorway here then, but otherwise nothing has changed. Let's see, the carriage house, Lowe house, and the Gordon house all seem to be almost the same as they were in 1912. Maybe I can find some of the homes of the first Girl Scouts. First I'll check the roster to find their address. These must be what Mrs. Aslaxon called the more mature girls, the White Rose Patrol. This is her patrol, the Pink Carnations. Mrs. Aslaxon said I should walk around Savannah a little and look at the houses. Then she'd tell me a little bit about who lived in them. Okay? Let's go! 215 Gwinnett East. Ann Reed's house. Do you remember Ann Reed?
Very distinctly. She was a beautiful blonde and an only child, and for that reason she seemed to be more mature than we were. Well, all of us were out in the big park, which was not sort of opposite Pape School, and we were all playing Crack the Whip when Ann Reed showed up with her date. And we were simply astonished, and I should say a little bit envious, but we were just still little girls and boys, and we were playing Crack the Whip, and she stood off in a superior manner and wondered how we could be so childish.
247 Bull, Helen Brigham's house.
They lived on the 3rd floor, and we were so surprised that she lived in an apartment.
119 Charlton East, Paige Anderson's house. Do you remember Paige Anderson?
Yes, very distinctly. Her mother was one of the loveliest people I ever knew, and she had the troop. And we always thought it was wonderful that her mother took an interest in the troop, when none of the other mothers seemed to do it.
226 Hall East, Martha Randolph. Do you remember?
Very distinctly. She was a very lovely-looking young girl, and very nice, and fun-loving.
413 Waldberg East, Elizabeth Peirce.
Elizabeth Peirce, I knew her very well, and she was the first person she was earned the first badge, which was a child nurse badge, And the thing that was interesting, she eventually took up nursing and never married.
16 Taylor East, Florence Crane's house. She lived with her Aunt Nina Pape, who raised both she and her brother after their mother died. So this is really Nina Pape's home. Do you remember her?
Oh yes, she was an intimate friend of mine, and she was the only person who was smaller than I was. We were both very small and very thin.
111 Huntington West, Bernice Fetzer. Do you remember Bernice Fetzer?
Very distinctly. She was an only child and had lovely red hair, and her mother died when she was young, and her father simply adored her, and she died in childbirth.
601 Whitaker, Harriet Stewart.
She was an intimate friend of mine. Her father was mayor of Savannah, and Harriet was gung-ho for Girl Scouting, and she earned every one of the badges.
116 Gaston West, Elizabeth Skeel. I'll bet the bay windows have been taken off her house since she lived here.
She was a very good friend of mine, and she was very intellectual. She came from a very intellectual family, and she always did very well in school.
421 Abercorn, Elsie Espy. Do you remember her?
Very well. She was a good friend of mine all through the years. And last time I saw her, we had a lot of fun reminiscing about our Girl Scout days. And her mother, you know, took a very great interest and established the first camp for Girl Scouts.
109 Bolton West, Walton Brewer. Mrs. Nance told me that the two of you and Elsie Espy used to go roller skating in Forsyth Park and share secrets under the lamplights.
Lisa also found the homes of 3 of the first leaders. She knew Mrs. J. Randolph Anderson's house was next door to Juliet Lowe's. She then discovered Mildred Cunningham's house. The third captain's house she found is famous for its unique Gothic architecture. Jean Meldron lived here in 1912, and it is called the Green Meldron House, or the St. John's Parish House.
In Savannah, I also went to Edith Beatty Blum's house, and she showed me her scrapbook. She joined the White Rose Patrol a little later, but she was a classmate of most of the girls and took her own pictures. She said she did all of the developing herself. Here's my favorite. It was taken in 1912. That's Paige Anderson picking violets, and there's Martha Randolph and Jean Cunningham. It's great knowing something about the people in the first troop. The Girl Guides in Savannah may have been different from the troops Juliet Lowe began in Scotland or in England, but Juliet Lowe's ideas were the same. She wanted all girls to join. I know when she went around the country organizing new troops, she made sure that girls from all walks of life were a part of Girl Scouting. The handbook must have helped. I'll find out from the first Girl Scouts what they did in their meetings. How often did you meet? Did you have dues?
Yeah, we had dues of a nickel a month, and we met once a week.
What was a typical meeting like? Like, did you sing or?
Well, we'd go there and we'd say the Girl Scout law and promise, and we'd just sort of, we'd go out and play basketball because Juliet Lowe had set up a basketball court across the street, and she thought, since in England the women always went in for tennis, and she thought the girls should have physical training. And so we'd play, she had 2 tennis courts, and we always took our tennis racket and we'd either play tennis or basketball.
What were some of the games you played?
Well, we played, mostly we skated. And since I was little, they always put me on the end of the line and would play crack the whip, and they'd crack me.
Did you play other games other than basketball and tennis and stuff?
Yeah, we would play tag, and we skated a lot because they had pavement over there in the park extension. And we did a lot of skating. and really enjoyed it.
Mrs. Walton Brewer Nance loved sports and said she had played tennis until just a few years ago. She remembers vividly playing basketball. When asked about the competition between the White Roses and the Pink Carnations, she said,
Of course. That is when the fur flew. Everybody was doing the best they possibly could then. It was always that little feeling, you know, between the two troops. We got along all right.
Paige Anderson Platt remembers athletics too.
Did the kids play sports?
Oh yes, well, mostly basketball. That was the sport that we played. And then we went out fishing and swimming and...
It looks like camping was an important part of the first Girl Guide meetings. Did you camp and where and what was it like?
We didn't do camping as they do now. Juliet Lowe owned about 5 acres outside of Savannah on a little saltwater creek called Bonabella. Had a cabin on there, and we'd go out there on day picnics. We did spend the night once or twice, and she had a retired botanist from Harvard who lived in the cabin, and he took all of us girls on walks through the woods to teach us the trees and the wildflowers and so forth. And once I was walking with Mr. Hoxie, and we came across a little snake that was swallowing a frog. So he stopped us and showed us how to. The snake would get the head of the frog in its mouth and then stretch it out so he could swallow it. And after he swallowed it, the snake was about this big, and then it had a bulge in the middle about that big. And Mr. Hoxie put it in a bottle with alcohol and gave it to me. And I had it for many, many years, and then my mother and father moved away. They didn't know whether that...
Mrs. Paige Anderson Platt told Lisa about another incident while they were out in the woods.
Well, she got us out with old Professor Hoxie, and we took nature courses out in the woods at Bonabella, which was out in the woods, and we were allowed to take rowboats and go out and go rowing, and I got stuck in a rowboat and couldn't come ashore because the tide went out. And that was very bad. So they all had to wait for hours until the tide came in again, and the rowboat and me came in because I couldn't row it in.
What were most of the things you did with Professor Hoxie?
Well, we went out to the woods, and he taught us about plants and animals and fish and any nature types that he knew a lot, so we listened and learned to that.
Well, Mrs. Aslaxon tells us you had to walk a mile from the end of the street, car line, to Bonabella where the classes were. Do you remember the cabin?
Well, it was just a tiny little hut off in the woods. We didn't mind that.
Did you camp out there?
Well, we camped out some of the time, not all the time, because our family didn't want us to stay out there all night. We just went out and played around in the daytime.
But Professor Walter John Hoxie's contribution to early Girl Scouting cannot be overestimated. He established the early camping and nature programs. Mr. Hoxie also adapted the English handbook into the first American handbook, How Girls Can Help Their Country. Among the papers and photos left to the Georgia Historical Society are many reminders. This hammock at Bonabella follows his advice in the handbook not to sleep on the ground. a nest of eggs is a hint of the nature studies the girls undertook. And the treehouse, a reminder of the fun shared together. I am sure it would give him great pleasure to know that the memory of him and what he taught the girls has come through all these years.
I can tell from the handbook that home life was a very important part of the early meetings. Mrs. Aslaxon remembers making peppermint drops and taffy in the carriage house kitchen. I do see a section on hospital working and patriotism. And the handbook mentions doing good turns. Maybe they'll remember something about that. Mrs. Nance, do you remember doing any service projects at your meetings?
Oh, yes. I think that came really right along with the organization. I don't remember what the activities were now, but I know we did have things that we did that were important then.
The early Girl Scouts learned and had fun at their meetings, but I learned the secret of what they did after the meetings were over. Charlton and Bull Street. Solomon's Drugstore? So this is the place where the first Girl Scouts came after their meetings to have sodas and chat. This is good. It's amazing how the stores remain the same after all these years. The floors, the tables and chairs, the woodwork, the fans, and even the beautiful leaded lights. Savannah's a wonderful place. Mrs. Aslaxon, you were right when you said, we were lucky little girls to have grown up in that day and that age in Savannah. And you were all there in the beginning. Such wonderful people to have known. Juliet Lowe, Mrs. J. Randolph Anderson, Nina Pape, Mr. Hoxley, and all of the first Girl Scouts. Thank you, Mrs. Mary Stewart Gordon Platt, for giving us insight into the visionary character of your aunt, the founder of Girl Scouting in America. Thank you, Paige Anderson Platt. Your high-spirited ways must have created so many enjoyable times. Thank you, Walton Brewer Nance. Even though you moved away after the first year, you seem such a close friend to so many of the girls. Thank you so much, Marion Corbin Aslaxon. Your wonderful memory and animated storytelling has recreated so many of these inspiring moments for me.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to share with you because the greatest joy in my life was when I was with the girls in Girl Scouting.
I think the first Girl Guides did a lot of the same things we do today. But I certainly have learned about the city of Savannah in 1912 and what an important impact Juliet Gordon Lowe had on the lives of women. I want to remember all the wonderful people I've talked to and what I've learned about their lives. I'm sure I will remember what I've learned today, but I must remember to tell my children. Thank you, Juliet Lowe.